We're starting a new series called Life in the Pack. Life in the Pack. Now, who likes nature programs? There's a few of you. I'm not a great fan, if I'm honest. But I know some of you are particularly interested. Some of you don't just like to watch the programs. Some of you like to get out there. We've got some passionate bird watchers. I've learned a new word recently called a twitcher. I thought a twitcher was somebody who did that a lot. But apparently a twitcher is somebody who goes around the country ticking off a list of birds. If you've ever been to John Longshaw's house, don't sit in front of the window, because he won't be paying any attention to you. He'll be looking out the window at what birds are flying past. Some of you are very passionate about wildlife and all these different programs that are on television. Now, I don't know a great deal about them, but what I do know is certain animals are designed to be in packs. They're designed to be in herds. They're designed to be in flocks. You've got those that are in packs to hunt. You've got like the wolf who belongs in a pack, who can hunt on its own, but in a pack is so much more effective. You've got the wildebeest, the buffalo, who go into packs for protection, who fend off the enemy by coming together. You've got the birds who fly together in that V shape so that they can. What sort of birds fly in a V shape, John? Geese. Any others? Swans. What ones are we likely to get around here? Both of those. So swans are okay. Look up and you'll see them flying in that V shape. And they do so for efficiency. They do so for speed. They can fly much further and they can fly much faster when they group together in such a way. Pack animals don't do well when they're on their own. They don't do well when they're outside of that family environment. And one of the reasons we've implemented life groups within this church on a regular basis is because we believe that as Christians, we need to be living as part of a pack. We need to be living as part of a family. And sometimes coming to church on a Sunday is wonderful. Hopefully, it's always wonderful. But we can't have those same conversations, those same relationships that you can have in a small environment. And it's so important that we don't just come and worship God together, but actually as Christians, we do life together. We're designed as Christians, as His church, to live in a family. Life in the pack. And that's what I want to speak on, is life in the pack. All through the Bible, you see that God wants us to live as a family unit. In Psalm 68, verse 5 to 6, it says this. Go for the slides up. Psalm 68, 5 to 6. A father to the fatherless and a defender of widows is God in His holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families, or it could be said the desolate in a homeland. Now, the person who wrote the psalm was David. The David of David and Goliath fame. Now, he had been anointed to be king, but there was already a king, and so there was a bit of jealousy, and there was a bit of intimidation, insecurity, and so Saul chased after David, and David had to live out in the wilderness for many, many years. And he was a very lonely figure until around him, God put a band of people that felt the same. And these people became his family. They became people that he did life with. They became people that supported him. So much so that as that relationship went on, these were people that were willing to risk their lives for David. And so when David says that God is a father to the fatherless, and when God sets the lonely in families, he knows what he's talking about. He's not just talking theology. God's done it in his life. When he was alone, God set him in a family. Galatians 6, verse 10. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. Now, Paul, who wrote to the church in this letter to the Galatians, he's writing, he's encouraging them. And he's saying, don't give up, because a lot of them were getting frustrated and their efforts didn't seem to be getting anywhere. And he's saying, don't give up. Just carry on doing good, especially to the family of believers. He's saying you're in a family. You're part of a family. Mark 3, 34 to 35. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. These are the words of Jesus. He's speaking to his disciples. He's speaking to the crowd around him. And he's reminding them that if you're a follower of Jesus, you are placed into a family. You are placed into a family. God designed us as Christians, as his church, to be a family, to live as a family. We're not designed to live alone, and yet so many people try and do that. As children growing up, God designed children to be in families. Now, whether it's been in my professional career before or in my ministerial place as a missionary or as a pastor, I've always worked with young people, and I've loved to work with young people. And so many of them found themselves in a situation where they weren't in families. I spent a lot of time as a police officer looking for what we termed missing from homes. People who just ran away from their family, who didn't want to be in that family environment. And normally, you would spend all your time searching for the same people, again and again, bringing them back to the home before you knew 2 or 3 days later, you'd be looking for them again. In the church in Slovakia, there was a big group of teenagers used to hang around, children and teenagers. They used to hang around the church all day. Any meeting in the church, they were there, not because they wanted to be in the meeting, but because the last place they wanted to be was home. They didn't want to be in their home environments. We thought there was revival. They just didn't want to be at home. And they wanted to be in somewhere where they felt like there was family. Now, some of that's really understandable. If you see the family situations that many of them grew up in, you'd see that was understandable. Anybody would want to get out of that sort of environments. But some others were a bit of a mystery because they had good family backgrounds. I can remember one girl that really struck me because her story is very much like the story of the prodigal son. And those who have been in church for a while will know the story of the son. It's in the book of Luke, that runs away from his father's house. And her story was very much like that. I first met her, and I think she was about 14 or 15, and she'd ran away from home. And I'd end up going to that house quite a few times. Now, her family, they were very well off. One was a doctor, one was a lawyer. Her parents, her older sister, she got a sister that was just a couple of years older, was emotionally very well. She was doing really well in her college work. The whole family seemed to be structured really well. It seemed to be a loving environment. Now, that's from looking from the outside in, but there was nothing that gave away anything about this family, that there was any problems whatsoever. But this girl just didn't want to be part of that family environment. A few years later, she would be in trouble for soft drugs. Then she'd be in trouble for shoplifting. Then later on, when she was about 18, 19, I came across her again in prostitution. She found herself in prostitution, then in harder drugs. And actually, during the course that I worked in that particular town, I would come across in a worse and worse environment, a worse and worse situation, because she was choosing to live life outside of family. And many Christians do the same. That's the physical family, but many Christians do the same. They choose to live life outside of family. You know, I can live a good Christian life on my own. I do not need anybody else to live my life for God. I can have a relationship with God on my own. Now, that's true in one sense, but actually, that's not the way you were designed. People say, I don't need others, I especially don't need the church. It's full of hypocrites. There's always room for one more. Many go to church. I mean, the people like that I'm not actually speaking to because they're not here. Unless you're at home watching this on video. Many go to church, but they never actually belong. They'll come on a Sunday, but they don't belong. Don't let others get close. Never let anybody else know who they really are. They come to church wearing a mask. Now, many times in the Bible, there's references not just to being somewhere or going somewhere. In the Old Testament, it would have been the temple, or in the New Testament, the houses, the house church, or the bigger meetings they had. Not just going somewhere, but belonging. There's references time and time again to belonging. Psalm 92 says this, verses 13 and 14. I've got to have it up there. Planted in the house of the Lord, they will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green. Now, this is a psalm that's written about the righteous being like a cedar tree. That if it's planted in the house of the Lord, it will flourish. Now, of course, the person writing the psalm at that point, they would be talking about the Jewish temple. And the trees they got were from Lebanon. And they were saying that these trees, if they were planted in the house of the Lord, if the Jewish people, if they were growing up amongst that sort of crowd of people, then they would flourish. They would flourish. Now that was referring to the temple, but time and time again in the Bible we see the same thing about belonging. Not just being somewhere, but being planted. Being planted. And that's why we want to introduce things like life groups so that you can find a place where you feel planted. When you're planted, your roots go down. When you plant, again, I'm talking about things I don't really know much about, so please correct me. But when you plant a tree, its roots go down and it mixes with the roots of the other trees around it. It's planted. I believe God wants you to find your place, not to be a butterfly Christian who just flies about from one place to another. Or even somebody who's like a postman at an address, just goes, visits, comes back, goes the next day, visits, and comes back. God wants us to live in the house. The first disciples, they were mainly the Jewish Christians. They would go to the temple, the place where they gathered. But then it also says in Acts chapter 2 that they also then met in each other's homes. They had those places of small fellowship where they really knew each other, really built up relationship. And so I believe, and this is the challenge, to some people, not just to come, but to be, to plant yourself, to find your place. So I want to look at what kind of family unit do we want to be here at Livestream? Well, to answer that question, I'm going to go back to the original design for family. The original design for family. You see, at the start of the Bible, in the creation story, we find Adam and Eve. As that whole explanation of creation takes place, we find these two people, Adam and Eve, the original family. And in there, this is God's creation, God's purpose for family. And I believe out of their story, we can find three particular things: that they were created to be in a support network. They were created to be in real relationships. And they were created to reproduce. Those first two chapters of Genesis are very important for telling us some things about our existence. The first is that God created the world. We're not here by chance. And I'm not going to give any sort of apologetics today about why that is so, how it can be true. But the Bible is clear. Genesis is clear that you're not here by chance. You're created. God created everything, and He created everything good. That's one of the other important things that we pull out of those first two chapters, that everything was created good, that He created us. And He created us with purpose. You've got a purpose. So Adam and Eve were that first family unit, created to be that perfect family unit. And I want to look at some of how they function to find the purpose for our own existence, about our need to belong into a family. The first thing I want to say is this. If we could have the next slide. The family is meant to be a support network. It tells us in Genesis why God created the family unit. Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. The Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make us helper suitable for him." And then a few verses later, Eve is created. Now, it says there that they were created one for another. The word helper, by the way, is not some sort of derogatory term that means Eve is lower than Adam. The word helper was that same Hebrew word that's translated helper is the same word that is later used to say that God is man's helper. It's the same word. So it's not a term that means one was lesser than the other. It's a term that means they were created to help each other. They were created to be a support network. It was not good that Adam was on his own. Adam was not created to be in isolation. Nobody is created to be in isolation. We're created to be part of a family. We're created to be part of a support network. In the book of Proverbs, it tells us that two are better than one. If one falls down, the other one is there to take a photograph, put it on Facebook, and then help them back up. They miss that out of Proverbs, but that's really how it works. When one falls, the other one is there to help them back up. We're created to be family. We're created to belong. We're created to be there for one another. And when that support network works properly, it's wonderful to see it. Whether you're the one who's able to help support others, or whether you're the one on the receiving end, it's actually wonderful to see. I can remember once when we were living in Slovakia. We'd only been there about 6 months, maybe a year. And Linda came to visit us. And it was her first visit to Slovakia. And I was tasked with going to the airport to pick her up. I drew the long straw. But I was going to the airport to pick her up. And on the journey there, it's about an hour's journey. On the journey there, all of a sudden, smoke started coming out of the front of the car. And the car started to make all this noise. And we're on the motor. I was on my own on the motorway. And I pulled into the side. I knew the car couldn't go any further. Now, Linda didn't have her phone turned on. So there was no way of getting in touch with her at that time. I was on my own. I didn't know how to call for help. Our language skills were not very developed then. So I was in a bit of a mess. I was in a very tricky situation. There was no real hard shoulder on the motorway. So I was actually in a dangerous position as well. And the speed limits were a lot faster there. So I was in a bit of trouble. And I rang up Milan, who a lot of you will know. He's come here a few times. He's an evangelist. And he was the pastor. He is the pastor of the church in Nova Zamki. And I rang him up and I said, I've got a problem. Now, he'd just driven from the other side of the country. He'd been in a conference, and he'd just driven from the other side of the country, about 400 miles, back home, and he'd just got in. And I said, I've got a problem, and I explained what the problem was. And he came, he picked me up, he organised the transport for the car. He then went with me to pick Linda up. We came back. And so for him, he'd already done a don't know how many hour journey. He then did another 3 or 4 hours helping us out, and I think it was late at night. It was probably late at night, early hours of the morning by then. And then later that week, at that point, we'd got no money. We'd got hardly anything. We were struggling just to buy food. The thought of actually fixing the car was in the garage, and we got no money for it. And this church heard about our predicament and sent us the money to fully fix the car. That's family working together. That's family working together. And it wasn't long after that Milan phoned me. Now, this was 2 o'clock in the morning. And he said to me, Mark, I've got a problem. Now, I was assisting him at that time, and I knew whenever he said, I've got a problem, it meant that I also had a problem. And so I said, what is it? And he was a bit embarrassed to tell me. I thought there was something serious up. And he said, I was coming back from Prague on the train, and I had a nap. And this was before the Schengen agreement. And he said, I've just woken up on the Hungarian border, asking for my passport. Could you come and get me? So I did. And I haven't mentioned it since many times in sermons. But it's family working together. We're meant to be family. We're meant to support each other. You know, individually, you can make a difference. But together, the difference we can make is not just added, it's multiplied. Several verses speak about 1, putting 1,000 to flight, 2, putting 10,000 to flight when God is in the middle of it. There's power that is multiplied when we're together, when we're each other's support network. Even Jesus, the Son of God, God the Son, had a support network around him. To build the church, Jesus built a network of people that were around him. If Jesus decided that was necessary, I think we'd be very arrogant if we don't think it's necessary. I want to challenge you with 2 questions regarding this. How willing are you to allow others to help you? Some of us don't mind helping others. but don't allow others to help us? That's a question for you. I want to challenge some of you with that. The second question is, how aware are you of the needs of those around you and where you can help? I want to challenge you this week to go away and think about those two questions. Because if we're going to be this God-ordained support network for one another, then we need to be able to answer those two questions. So the family is called to be a support network. It's also called to be real. If we could go on to the next slide. God created us to help each other, but also created us to be real with one another. In Genesis 2, verse 25, it says, Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. They felt no shame. They were walking, talking with each other. They were talking with God. God created Adam and Eve naked. It was only after they'd started to sin and started to rebel against God that they felt the need to cover up. There was no need to do it until that had happened. And ever since that time, they were living behind a mask. But they were created to be real. They were created to know each other. Of course, being naked is a metaphor for being real. I'm not suggesting for one moment that you come to church like that. But God has created us to be real, in real relationships. He wants you to be you. That doesn't mean we come and we just accept all the sin that we're doing and don't do anything about it. But actually, you need to be you in order for God to work on you. We don't come trying to be somebody else, trying to be the person we think God wants us to be, or trying to be who others think we ought to be, or even worse, who we think we ought to be. We come being us and open ourselves up for God to work on us. So many people come to church and avoid getting close to anybody. Who knows you? I mean, who really knows you? Who knows the sins that you struggle with? Because if nobody does, that's a problem. You've got nobody to protect you. See, families know each other. You know, as missionaries, people really looked up to us and spoke highly of us. And when we went around, people were speaking so highly until my family came to visit, and they'd just spoil it by knowing the real us. Families know the real you. They know what you're like under pressure. The real you comes out. Not always nice, is it? Families know the real you. And that's not an excuse for sin. That's a place to be set free. Because when you're real, when John writes his letters, he talks about bringing things out into the light, being honest, being open, because that's where we find forgiveness. That's where we find change. Families know each other. You know, when I went through a time in Slovakia where I was at my lowest, just physically, mentally, and emotionally broken completely, we tried to hide it as a family for some time, for many months, until eventually we knew we had to open up. We had to speak to others about it. And they were more than willing to come and help and support. Didn't find any judgment, just total love that got us through that period. And we were able to help others as well. When you're real, we don't like to be real because of fear. because of judgment. But when you're real, that's when healing comes. Only just before Christmas in December, I was speaking to a pastor. I was at a training day with a number of other pastors. And I was just having a really good conversation with the pastor that was sitting next to him. And he started to open up to me and tell me his story, his backstory. Now, he'd struggled for all his teenage life and for all his life in his 20s as an adult with same-sex attraction. He'd spent all that time, and he was scared to tell anybody because he felt, he was in the church, and he felt people would be angry with him and judge him. And eventually, this guy, by the way, he's a pastor, and he's I think the same age as me, and he's about to get married to a wonderful woman this year. It was when he opened up, when he talked about it, that he found healing. He didn't find judgment. He was set free and found healing. Whatever your struggle is, healing comes when we're open. Purpose comes when we're real. And this is the church that we want to see here at Livestream. A church where people can be real. They can be real about their struggles. Where in the men's group, men can be real. Men can talk about the problems they're having with pornography. I'm pointing over here because Roger's leading the men's group. Okay, I just want to make that very clear. Where people can talk about the things they struggle with, find prayer, find support. Instead of finding judgment, they find people that will come alongside and help them. A place where people can be real. Because it's only when you're real you can find freedom. A place where you don't have to pretend you've got certain gifts or qualities in order to be accepted. That's the church that we see. That's the church that we're striving for. A church where you can be honest about the difficulties you're facing and find help. To drop the mask of yeah, I'm okay, I'm fine, yeah, great. And actually be real about some of the hurts you're struggling through right now. To drop the, yeah, fine, I can cope with that. And actually be real about the fact that you really do need help. I want to challenge you with these questions again. Do people know the real you? Are there brothers and sisters, because we're family, who know the real you? And secondly, the second question to that is this. Are you the sort of person that people can be real with? Do people know that when you tell them things, they're still going to be accepted? They're still going to be loved? A place that is real. And finally, the family is called to reproduce. God didn't intend Adam and Eve just to stay as a couple. He created the family to grow in number. You know, immediately after this account of creation, when God declares that he made human beings, he tells them to increase. Genesis 1:28. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." God called Adam and Eve to reproduce, to make room for new birth. Now, everybody loves a newborn baby, to look at a newborn baby, and they're wonderful, and you're going to have that joy soon of that newborn baby. But they're actually hard work, aren't they? Lovely to look at and give back, but they're actually hard work. Your routine's disturbed. Nothing will ever be the same again. Your routine is disturbed. You've got to focus on somebody. You can't focus on your needs anymore. Your need for sleep. You can't focus on you. Your focus is on others. And people put off for longer and longer starting a family. Couples put it off for longer and longer because of career. Because of they're in a career, they don't want that to be disturbed. Because of money, they feel they need to get it to a certain level of income before they start a family. Because of lifestyle, they're enjoying the fact they can go on holiday in school time, or they can go abroad without having to book an extra flight, or all these sort of things. And people put off for longer and longer having family. Now, I know from personal experience that the joy of having children. But there's those early periods I'm somebody who I love the 2 years and above age. When you can really interact. I know Liz loves that, that early. I find them a bit boring at that stage, I've got to be honest. I'm bored. It's not doing anything. That's about it. But the joy of children makes it worth it. One of the greatest joys in my life is being a father. One of the greatest pleasures and privileges I have in life is being a father. But you've got to be willing to go through that disruption to get there. Adam and Eve found that being parents wasn't easy. Their firstborn child killed their secondborn. That's not a good start to parenthood. It must have been devastating. But they carried on because it was through their children they would live out their purpose on this earth. The church can be the same. New birth sounds great. Having new people in the church sounds wonderful. But it's actually a big responsibility. Some people, spiritual parenting of some people can be quite difficult. They can come in with all sorts of baggage. Growth equals problems. Some people are like a little family. We were about 15 or 16 people at one point in Shala, as we were just going through that growth period. And somebody said to me, a Christian who'd been a Christian for probably about 20 years and had prayed for the church for about 20 years. And when we got to about 15 or 16, she said, I don't want it to grow anymore. Seriously. And she was just being honest. She said, I quite like it as it is. We can be like that. Because some people like little family. The comedian Michael McIntyre, he once did a sketch about the difficulties of parenting. And he talked about how, couples, they often look at little babies, they go, oh, I want one of those. But they don't realize how lucky they are and the freedom they have not having children. Because when you don't have children, you're going out the house, looks something like this. I'm going out now, dear. Okay, good. That is going out the house in the morning if you do not have children. If you have children, you know it's different. Noah, come down. We're late. Where are your shoes? Don't know. Go get your shoes. Jess, why are you still on the loo? Come on, we said we'd go 5 minutes ago. Come on. Put it. You've got your heart. And that's just Liz. Now, but it's completely different. Because when you have family, everything changes. Everything changes. And I believe that we're called to be a church that is reproducing. The life groups are called to reproduce more life groups. They're called to grow. We need to be a welcoming people and helping people to grow. But it takes time, it takes effort, it takes commitment from every one of us. And there's going to be sacrifices. You know, if you're like me, you like a deep sermon. Like plenty of meat. But actually, if we're welcoming new people in, then we have to be prepared for milky sermons. Because it's not about us. It's not about what we need. It's about the people coming in. And actually, when our focus changes, when we become parents, and our focus is taken off our growth, something strange happens that we actually grow more. And I find this in church. Christians who just want deep sermons are often babies. But Christians who take the time to bring on new Christians, spend time with them explaining simple truths, grow so much in their Christianity compared to those who just sit there, feed me, give me deep, give me meat, let's have a good discussion about it. We've got to be willing to sacrifice. Our style is no longer the most important. Mess. You can't have children and not have mess. Yes. Somebody agrees with me. We need to take our eyes off our own needs for growth, and then we grow. It's ironic that when we take our eyes off our own need for growth and look to help others grow, we grow. Are you willing to put the needs of new Christians above your own? That's my question for you. If we want to see our God-given destiny, and of course I'm not saying we're not going to have deep stuff, but it's not going to be focused on us. It can't be focused in the life group. It can't be focused on what we need. It's got to be focused on welcoming. God has called us to be a family. I want to ask, are you willing to put your roots down? It's only when we put roots down that we flourish. God wants us to be a support network. He wants us to be real. And he wants us to grow. Now, there are times when we do need to leave the family. But it shouldn't be that we run away. You know, we've left family twice. Once was to leave this church. This was our only church up until the point that we left to be missionaries. And we've been here for about 15 years. And we left to go and be missionaries for 10 years. And then we left our family there after 10 years and came back here. But each time, we were sent. Sent by God primarily, but also released by people. You know, it does say in Genesis 2:24 that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. There is a time for leaving. And as a church, we want to be a releasing church. So it was so beautiful to send Brad off the other week. And he's doing great, by the way. But that's a wonderful thing when you release as a family. When you release people into their purposes. And I don't even know if Brad's ever going to come back to this church. And you know what? I want him to be wherever God places him. And if he's not with us, then that's fine. We'll miss him, but it's fine. We don't just release people so that we get them back again. But I want us to be a family, a church that supports, a church that is real. Are you ready for the mess of new birth? Are you ready to live life in the pack?